Welcome back to this, the fourth episode of Praying the Psalms in a World on Fire. I am your host, Tom First, and today we are going to talk about genre. And I do not want you to immediately get afraid thinking that this is going to be an academic or a purely literary discussion, because what I really want to do with this discussion is talk to you about how the genre of the Psalms, the various genres within the Psalms, actually teach us to pray in a world on fire. Imagine walking into a library and finding not one kind of book, but every kind. Protest pamphlets, love songs, national anthems, personal diaries, and poetry. That's what the book of Psalms is like. Each psalm is unique, but together they form a family of genres, different voices teaching us how to pray in various life circumstances. When we talk about genre, we're talking about family resemblance, literary family resemblance. Genres don't fit exact molds, but like family, they share certain traits. They establish a set of expectations that enables the reader to identify the psalm's various patterns and parts, how the psalm moves from beginning to end. At the same time, though, a genre also, while establishing expectations, also shows us how to break expectations, how to break patterns when necessary to surprise the reader. And that's where often the distinctiveness of the individual psalms comes through, where they break the patterns. But in order to break the patterns, or notice when the psalm is breaking a pattern of the genre, you actually got to understand the genre itself. So, for example, one of the hallmarks of psalmic poetry is parallelism. The psalms don't rhyme like English poetry often does. Instead, the psalms place two lines in conversation with each other, different words, but the same ideas. Take, for example, Psalm 27:3. The psalmist says, "Though a camp is marshaled around me, my heart shall not fear. Though a battle is roused around me, none the less do I trust." This is poetry, not by exact repetition or rhyming, but by echoing, by saying the same thing in a completely different way. The second line deepens and expands the first line, giving us a rhythm of thought that teaches us how to pray with confidence even under threat. In the 20th century, Old Testament scholar Hermann Gunkel gave us the most influential way of classifying the Psalms. He noticed that while each psalm is unique in itself, most fall into certain broad categories. They have certain family resemblances with each other. He had four categories that are helpful to understand. The first is that some psalms are hymns, that is, their communal praises for God's mighty acts in history. Second, though, he said that some psalms are songs of thanksgiving. They're individual prayers that spring forth out of gratitude for God having delivered the individual from some despairing situation. The third is called a communal lament. It is the whole people of God crying out in grief over some injustice or despair they feel. They're asking God in their lament to act. And then, four, you have individual laments. This is perhaps one of the most common forms of the Psalms. It is where one person voices pain and pleads for God to step in and act, often saying, "God, I expected you to act before now, but you haven't." And so you can almost kind of picture it on a chart. On the one side, you have hymns that are praising and thanksgiving on the left side, and on the right side of the chart, you have lamentation and grief being expressed. But then if you divide that right and left chart into top and bottom, on the top you also have individual expressions of praise and grief. And on the bottom you would have communal expressions of praise and grief. And the whole point here is that whether it is hymns or laments or thanksgivings or cries for help, together the Psalms convey the full range of human life before God. Walter Brueggemann came along after Hermann Gunkel, and he actually classified the Psalms in three big movements, and these are actually pretty influential for me. He said that first, we could talk about the Psalms as some of them being Psalms of orientation. The second is Psalms of disorientation. And then we can talk about a third category of Psalms, Psalms of new orientation or reorientation. So let's unpack each of these. The first is the Psalms of orientation. They are written in times when life is steady, life is good, the world feels ordered, and God feels in control. But then the second category is the Psalm of disorientation. These are psalms written when life plunges into chaos. Whether it's individual or communal, there is a dissatisfaction with life. There is grief in life and trauma. There is the experience that God is absent. And so these psalms will often protest or lament or express despair. Those are psalms of disorientation. The third category is the psalms of new orientation or reorientation. These psalms bring us through to joy on the other side of grief. Praise in these psalms comes after God has acted and delivered the people, after God has acted in history and rescued somebody or rescued the community. And so this threefold pattern, I think, has been so influential for me because it really genuinely reflects the journey of faith itself. That there are times when we feel that things are good and life is oriented and God seems to be present and you can see the fingerprints of God on everything you do. And then there are times in life when it seems like everything is shattered and life feels chaotic. And then there are other times on the other side of that grief and trauma where only through the perspective of time and wisdom can we look back and say that, oh, I see how God worked even when I didn't feel like God was at work. So I have always appreciated Brueggemann's categories, three big movements of the Psalms. Now, I told you at the beginning that this is not going to just be an academic conversation, that this is about learning to pray in a world on fire, and how does genre help us do that? So that's the question I want to end with. Why does this discussion of genre even matter? Well, I think it matters because each type of psalm forms us differently. Hymns remind us to praise when despair is tempting us to forget God. Thanksgiving psalms train us to remember past deliverance and to resist cynicism. Lament psalms, both communal and individual, give us courage to protest, to tell the truth about our suffering and our grief and our trauma, and to demand that God show up in a situation where it seems like God has been absent. Or to think about this in terms of orientation, disorientation, and new orientation. That cycle of Psalms teaches us that faith is not static, that spiritual formation moves, struggles, tries to survive, and sometimes looks back and expresses gratitude that we did survive. This is, to me, why the genre discussion matters. It teaches us that spirituality is resistance. The Psalms resist loneliness by teaching us to lament. They resist despair by training us to praise. They resist idolatry by calling us back to God as our only King. And they resist the resignation of depression by reminding us that new joy is always possible on the far side of suffering. This means then that every genre of the Psalms, whether it's a hymn or lament or thanksgiving or wisdom or a song of trust, every genre is trying to form us in faith in different ways. But together, they shape us into a people who can grieve honestly, praise boldly, and hope stubbornly, even for a world that we can't yet imagine. And that is why every psalm, in its own way, is capable of teaching us to pray in a world on fire. The genre is only the beginning. Underneath the poetry and the laments and the hymns lies a deeper question. A picture of God emerges when we read the Psalms. What is the theology of the Psalms, their vision of who God is and how God acts in the world? In our next episode, we will explore the theology of the Psalms and how the various images of God in the Psalms form us to resist empire and to trust in God's reign in a world on fire.